Today we're talking budget and the preparation for the same in terms of mentally, psychologically, and just understanding what do we expect come tomorrow when the CS, the National Treasury, goes and tables the Finance Bill 2019 and gives a raft of proposals and policy directives in regards to the way forward for the next financial year, that is the 2019-2020. And like I had introduced earlier, I've got James Mulili, Senior Tax Manager at PKF, Phyllis Kamau, who's a lawyer in corporate, commercial and regulatory policy, as well as Churchill Ogutu, Senior Research Analyst for Macroeconomics and Fixed Income at Jengis Capital. Thank you for joining us, gentlemen and lady. Let's just begin with an overall view, like off the top of your head, what is your view in regards to the expectations for tomorrow? I'll begin with you, James.
Thank you, Dan. It's indeed a very ambitious budget for the government. And, the thing that is quite worrying is if you look at the expected tax revenues of 1.8 trillion, we are realistically looking at a funding gap of almost 1 trillion. Now, what really can the government do to make sure that these targets by KRA are met? From a tax perspective, it is important that the government comes up with tax measures that will spur growth, business growth. Now, if we look at the budget policy statement, it actually is themed creating jobs, transforming lives, harnessing Big Four agenda. That is the reality that has to be actualized. Let's put the Big Four agenda on one hand and focus on the first two parts of that theme: creating jobs, transforming lives. And the sentiments that were just previously aired are a true manifestation of that fact.
That is in the story that...
In the story on the streets,
yes.
Because that lady is saying, I have this much rent to pay, housing fund levy, hiyo pesa itatoka wapi? That was her comment. And it's really the reality that governments need to put into focus. Are they over-ambitious with the Big Four agenda? Is the Big Four agenda a priority? Are there aspects of the Big Four agenda that the government can actually narrow its focus on, with a view, obviously, of making ease of doing business, the tax burden that is faced by businesses, make it a conducive environment? That's the only way they can be able to realize this huge budget.
Okay. Yeah. Phyllis, quickly, what is your overall thought about the expectations for tomorrow?
Yes, of course. We are expecting that the government will continue with a budget that is supporting the Big Four agenda. And, the Big Four agenda is underpinned with a lot of budget allocation for key industries, energy, infrastructure. And this has put a lot of pressure in terms of debt. As much as there's the budget, there's a lot of good promises in terms of the Big Four. There's the big question of the debt to revenue ratio. There's a big question on our debt. There's a big questions around payments to local suppliers. There's the question of revenue collection by KRA, the deficits, and how we are going to do that. So I'm expecting not much surprises in terms, because if you look at the budget policy statements, it still talks about the Big Four agenda and the key issues the government is trying to achieve. However, we are expecting to see how the government is going to address the question of debt. We want to see how the government is proposing, around expansion of tax bracket. I think there will be a lot of proposals around trying to get more taxpayers within the tax, which is a priority for KRA. I think there will be some issues around proper tax administration. And so really it is a question of, you have an ambitious budget, but really do you have the money to meet it? And what are the policy proposals around that? And I know the other thing is that the government has been keen to ensure it doesn't increase taxes or introduces a lot of new taxes. So there's a lot of emphasis on efficiency and administration and bringing people within the tax system. And I think that is part of what I'm expecting tomorrow.
Okay. Churchill.
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, I'd like to see the tax measures that will be put in place. Remember that we are seeing an increase of 214 billion to 1.8 trillion in new ordinary revenue in the next fiscal year. And from what I'm seeing in terms of Treasury projections in the overall GDP, nominal GDP growth rate, they're looking at around 10% So I'm looking at that split of 214 billion, whereby 165 billion will be from an expectation that there'll be a 10% in nominal GDP growth, and then the other 49 billion should be coming from new tax measures. But of course, there'll be a bit of some trade-off looking at how the revenue performance has been in the last couple of years. As at this financial year, the data as at April, we are down at 13% on a pro rata basis in terms of the revenue collection. So my thinking is, okay, there'll be a bit of some trade-off. There could be some new revenue measures. And of course, bearing in mind that the current revenue measures have been subpar. Another issue in the overall budget is looking at how, where we started at BPS, the budget policy statement, which came out in February. We are looking at disbursements to the national government of around 1.8 trillion shillings. And then come April, Treasury had its own draft budget estimates, which upped it to around 1.9 trillion. And what you've seen by the Budget and Appropriation Committee, which is now being debated, we are looking at 1.93 trillion, which should be the overall budget, going to executive, having the lion's share, judiciary and legislative. Of course, it puts some pressure. There's been an increase of a total of 106 billion from the BPS estimate to where we are being debated currently. Even today, the better part of today in National Assembly, 106 billion in terms of the overall budget increase. So pressure, of course, will be on how we are able to raise revenues to be able to meet this overall expenditure, bearing in mind that there's been a bit of revenue underperformance in the last couple of financial years.
Okay, thank you. That's some good overall insight. And before we continue our discussion, speaking about money and budgeting and benefits, financial benefits that should be budgeted for, there's a hearing for a petition by the SRC, Salaries and Remuneration Commission, against the Public Service Commission's decision to allocate MPs backdated housing allowances, which is ongoing at the Milimani Law Courts. And currently speaking is Peter Wanyama, who's the lawyer for the SRC. Let's listen in for just a bit to get a gist of what's happening there. The court procedure is still ongoing, and what we know from Silas Apollo, who's in court following this story, is that earlier on, Ojenda, that's Tom Ojenda, who's holding forth for the MPs, says that he argues that Parliament cannot sit if MPs are not able to come to Nairobi, especially those living outside Nairobi, and perhaps in reference to lack of money to facilitate their stay in Nairobi. That is what he seemed to have been insinuating. And he wants orders issued barring payments of the allowances set aside until a later date. He says, the quote is that at this point we are stifling Parliament in regards to the fact that they should, the SRC argues they should not get the housing allowance, the 250,000 shilling per month per MP. And so Silas Apollo is following up that for us, and we shall be touching base with him later on as we go along with our broadcast, be it during NTV Today or NTV Sasa or 1 p.m. bulletin, but shall keep you updated definitely. And you can keep checking our Twitter handle at NTV Kenya that gives you that information real time as it happens. Now, I'll come back to pretty much touching on that. We've got the burden of wage bill, and we're seeing MPs are really pushing to get this additional, allowance, which the SRC is saying is not tenable. We cannot afford it as a country. How do we strike the balance? For instance, if an MP says, I'm working and maybe I've gotten to a point where I deserve a pay rise, but anytime they want a pay rise, Kenyans are up in arms saying, no, you cannot be doing that when you're all suffering. What's the balance between, giving them, like every other employee wants a pay rise, and them now becoming what many have called greedy?
Yeah, we are looking at a situation where, unfortunately, as Kenyans, we put ourselves in that trap in 2010 with the new constitution. Now, over the years, there's been this imbalance between recurrent expenditure and development expenditure. And that's where the problem starts. Then, to add wood to the fire, the debt obligations that the country is currently facing. And really the government is in a catch-22, because how do you balance this out? You're looking on one hand, the legislature is actually pushing for an increase in pay. And this is a situation that we'll have to contend with as it is, because the imbalance in the allocations to recurrent and development expenditure are largely due to how our structures are. And as they came through with the 2010 constitution, the 47 counties. There has been talk about a referendum. I think it is time we had a serious discourse about it, because the current county government structure cannot be sustained by the government. And we will keep revisiting this issue year on because of the increasing demands for the MPs and basically the recurrent expenditure by government employees. So that is an area that requires further action from a constitutional basis. And it's something that won't go away. But I choose to look at it in a different light. We're already in that situation. It's a situation that cannot change overnight. But what can the government do to be able to alleviate this burden? And I'll use a very simple example and some numbers that are actually quite shocking. If you look at mobilization of tax revenues, income tax accounts for almost 42% of tax revenues, followed by value-added tax at about 23%. Then there is excise duty and customs duties, following in that sense. Now, Dan, are you aware that only 2.8% of employed staff earn more than 100,000 shillings? Put that aside. If you look at the total number of registered taxpayers in Kenya who are on the iTax platform, is around 3.5 million. The 1.8 trillion tax revenues we are talking about is expected to come from the 3.5 or 4 million taxpayers. Out of that sum, it is only around 1.5 million individuals as well as corporates who are actively involved in payment of tax. Now, that in itself shows a very big problem, one, in terms of tax compliance numbers, and two, in terms of the reach of the tax net. Now, there was something very interesting that was introduced at the beginning of this year called Presumptive Tax through the Finance Act 2018. And what they said, with a view to expand the tax net, let us also tap into what we call the informal sector, that is said to account for almost 50 to 60% of the Kenyan GDP, and bring them into the net. And what they did is to have a simple tax called presumptive tax, to say 15% of the single business licenses will be presumptive tax for anyone with turnover of 5 million and less. Now, if we were to do very simple mathematics for the past 5 months, January to May, assuming a single business license is 50,000 shillings, 15% of that is 7,500 shillings. Assuming a county has 1 million licenses to register in a year, that comes to around 7.5 billion shillings. If you were to multiply that by the number of counties, we are looking at hundreds of billions of tax revenues just coming from the informal sector. Now, where I'm headed with this, which sort of tends to contradict the pain we saw on the street in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of increase in tax rates, one thing that every Kenyan needs to understand is that it's each and every one of us responsibility to pay tax. It cannot be a burden that is only allocated to employees. It cannot be a burden that is only allocated to corporates. Each and every one of us needs a good road. Each and every one of us wants to plug into the Big Four agenda: food security, universal health care, increased housing and all that. But
industry,
everyone has to contribute. And you see that initiative to try and have a trail, to try and have a documentation of the informal sector was a step in the right direction. However, what has been happening in the last 3 years is quite worrying, because The struggle by KRA to collect taxes has been because businesses are not doing well, and that is a fact. At least from where we come from and in our industry, we have a visibility as to the financial numbers of whether listed companies or private entities, and they are not doing well. The number of discussions that are coming up in boardrooms about laying staff have a direct impact to this target of 1.8 trillion. Laying off staff is impacting pay-as-you-earn collections. Companies scaling down or winding up has a direct impact to income tax collections. What does that point to? It really points to a situation where the government needs to think about how do we promote businesses. You look at a Big Four agenda on manufacturing, where they want to say, or they are saying they are targeting to have manufacturing contribute 15% of the GDP. Last year's projection was that manufacturing sector grew by 4.2%. We are way off target. But is the manufacturing sector supported by the government to be able to expand, to be able to go back to the theme and create employment? That is currently not happening. Now, is it time really for the government to consider two main things? An economic tax stimulus, which basically means let the government bite the bullet for a certain number of years, say 2 or 3 years, reduce the income tax burden on companies, incentivize them to reinvest whatever saving it will be. The corporate tax rate is 30%. Bring it down to 20%. What that means is that companies have an additional 10% equivalent in terms of money to reinvest in business, grow businesses, create more employment. Let the government take that hit, but in hindsight, what they'll be doing, they'll be empowering companies, they'll be empowering employers, they'll be empowering individuals to actually have more disposable income to get into employment. And you see the struggles on the street are directly related to the fact that the Kenyan person is already overtaxed. The amount of disposable income is dwindling. If you go to the supermarkets over the weekend, what people used to buy 5 years ago with 1,000 shillings is barely a basket full of items because the purchasing power has gone down. That has a direct impact to indirect taxes, VAT, excise duty, name it. So, increase in taxes is not the solution. The solution is, can you create really an environment that will spur business growth? And that should be the resounding theme for government.
Okay, that's some good